This week on the Andrew Yang podcast.
I think liberalism should be proud of its vision of the future. And I think political movements need both a negative and positive identity. By negative identity, I mean they need a sense of negative polarization. What are you against? What are you defining yourself against? But also liberals need, I think, a positive vision of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
If not just for the campaign trail, then for actually governing.
It is my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast economics writer for The Atlantic, host of Plain English, which is a really popular Ringer podcast you should definitely check out, and co-author of the brand new book, Abundance, Derek Thompson. Welcome, Derek.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Wow, man. Where did it get started with Abundance? So first, how did this project kick off? Because you have a co-author, Ezra Klein, who's also been on the podcast, but how did this collab come to pass?
Ezra and I were talking a lot in 2021 about a variety of issues on the phone. I was living in D.C. I think he was in San Francisco just before his move to New York City. And we were talking about politics and crypto for a variety of reasons and just sort of getting in each other's head in terms of ideas about the world and the future of liberalism. And as I was coming off of a book leave for a book that will never ultimately be written or completed, Ezra wrote this wonderful piece for the New York Times about the economic mistake the left is finally confronting. And this was a piece in which he made this really beautiful turn where he said a lot of liberalism, a lot of the Democratic Party's priorities over the last half century have been on the demand side of the ledger. That tax and spending liberalism has done a lot of good, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, EITC, but we've mostly focused on the tax side of the ledger, the spending side of the ledger. What's been left unexamined is the other side, the supply side. What are you actually building? And in some cases, for example, in housing markets, if you send a lot of housing vouchers into the system and you constrain the supply of housing, macroeconomics says there's only one way for housing prices to go, and that's straight up, because you're putting more demand into a system with less supply. And he said liberalism should think about supply side as well.
Maybe building some
building some things, for example, such as houses and apartment buildings. And so I saw this, and I had been working on these ideas about sort of scientific and technological progress and the history of scientific and technological progress. And what I saw in that observation was this idea that he was focusing on implementation. He was focusing on what is actually done with ideas. And a couple months later, in January or February of 2022, I was standing in line waiting for a COVID test in the freezing winters of Washington, D.C., and getting really, really upset about the fact that the entire pandemic seemed to me to be just one experience of scarcity after another. We didn't have enough PPE, then we didn't have enough vaccines, then we didn't have enough COVID tests. And as I was getting really pissed off, genuinely pissed off, I sort of zoomed out in my head and thought, it's not just the pandemic, it's this entire century. There's just been one story of scarcity after another, whether it's housing or we can't build enough clean energy, or even right after the pandemic was over, there were these supply chain crises that created shortages of goods, whether it's food or furniture or something else that we use for housing. Cars for a minute, yeah, semiconductors. And so I wrote this article about what I called the abundance agenda. I said this has been a scarcity century, and America deserves a movement that is absolutely obsessed with creating an abundance of the most important material goods and services: housing, energy, healthcare, even education, transit, certainly infrastructure, and then science and technology, right? Life-saving discoveries. So Ezra texted me when this piece was written, and he said, it kind of feels like you and I are chasing the same idea from opposite sides. We could, on the one hand, choose door number one and race each other to writing two competing books, or maybe it'd be a little bit easier if we joined forces and wrote the same book together. And then that's exactly what happened. And so Abundance publishes, tomorrow that we're speaking, Tuesday, March 18th, and it's been a long road, but we're finally here.
Well, congratulations, man, because I love the abundance agenda. I mean, when I was running for president, I was trying to get people out of the zero-sum game and the tit for tat and everything else. I think that you and Ezra collaborate is actually a very abundant move in itself, isn't it? Instead of being very like,
I suppose we reduced the number of books, but increased the amount of cooperation. And yes, from a positive sum outcome, we definitely believed that working together in this project would produce something greater.
But yeah, I remember when you announced the abundance agenda, and it was a piece in the Atlantic, and it's still pinned to your profile. And I have been a proponent along various dimensions. One thing I want to dig into, just make sure we cover it because I think it's so fascinating, and you mentioned it just now, science. So one of the chapters in the book is about how we're not really inventing the right things. It went through an example of someone who had this really promising mRNA research that then just couldn't get funded for whatever reason. And it's like because I have some passing familiarity with this because I have some academics in my family or whatnot. But it is a story about how you have institutions that are sending a lot of money toward research, but it's not going towards some riskier things. And then you wound up with people who it's like, oh, shit, like if I propose anything risky, I don't get my grant. So let me just keep on doing variants of the same stuff.
Catalin Carrico is an immigrant who for years worked in total obscurity and anonymity at UPenn. She was obsessed with the promise of mRNA. She thought it was so interesting that we could maybe deliver therapies that would disappear. They would teach our cells how to make certain proteins, as mRNA can do, and then it would disappear from the body, and our immune systems would remember how to make that protein and teach maybe our various T cells to attack that certain protein if that's what we wanted to do. The story that I tell in the book is a story, it's a sad story, I think, an angering story of how the system ignored Carrico's work. Ignored. There were periods, years, where she was essentially using money that was allocated for a totally different purpose to keep the dream of synthetic mRNA therapies alive. And the reason the story is so important for our world today is that her work formed the basis of the mRNA vaccines that Moderna and BioNTech, working with Pfizer, ended up making. These vaccines likely saved between 5 and 10 million lives. One of the most important scientific breakthroughs of our time, the ability of these mRNA vaccines to teach our bodies to recognize the spike protein at the tip of the coronavirus, corona so named because there's a crown of spiky proteins that surround the virus particle itself. And this vaccine taught our systems how to recognize it and in many ways saved the world and the world economy. Just a remarkable breakthrough. But the reason this is an angering story is to recognize just how the system we have set up ignored her work. And in fact, I think it ignores a lot of excellent, high-quality, high-risk, high-reward research. We have a system of funding science at the NIH, which, to take a brief aside, because it's being absolutely attacked and gutted by the Trump administration right now, the NIH has done extraordinary work in its sort of 70-year modern history since it was transformed into really, the fountainhead of biomedical research. It has its fingerprints over practically every single biomedical breakthrough that we have. That said, it is a 70-year-old institution. And Andrew, I know that you're passionate about understanding institutions so that we can reform them to do their job better.
Yeah.
We should not take institutions that are flawed and utterly destroy them. That's what the Trump administration is trying to do right now.
Yeah.
But what this chapter of the book really looks hard at is talking to scientists about how we should reform NIH in order to get it to go after the most groundbreaking science, young, promising researchers, and maybe this is most fundamental. There's some surveys that suggest that the typical American scientist today spends 40% of his or her time filling out grants or filling out the paperwork that is attached to those grants. 40% of their time working out paperwork rather than actually doing science. I think this is a scandal. I think that if there were a disease, for example, that broke out in America such that it gave scientists such chronic fatigue disorder that they had to sleep for 40% of the year, we'd say this is an absolute disaster for the country. How do we fix this virus? How do we fix this disease? This is a disease that we've given ourselves, this disease of bureaucratic kludge. So the chapter really looks hard at understanding what the NIH does and looking at finding wise ways to reform it so that we can have more scientific breakthroughs that save and extend people's lives faster. I really want to contrast that to the Trump administration's solution, which is not to understand the NIH at all, but rather to use the NIH as a weapon to punish universities that they want to see bend the knee, slash funding, destroy all sorts of unbelievably promising work on mRNA and RNA and genetics and cancer research, gut American science. That is the wrong way to deal with the fact that some of our institutions need reform, but it is the way that Republicans are going to deal with it as long as Donald Trump is their leader. And we Democrats need to find a way to talk about institutional reform in a way that separates us, distinguishes us from the slash and burn style of Republicans, and distinguishes us from the protect our institutions at all possible costs, protect the status quo at all possible costs approach that the modern Democratic Party sometimes takes, where it says, well, because we have all the institutionalists on our side, we're going to defend the status quo as long as Republicans attack it. That's the wrong approach, too. We want institutional reform for our time to produce the best outcomes.
Yeah, man, that's the best summary I've heard in quite some time that wasn't from me.
If I may say so humbly.
Join us for the second annual Hudson Valley Ideas Festival, where a diverse community of entrepreneurs, artists, thought leaders, and writers converge to tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time. Tickets available now at hudsonvalleyideas.org.
Thank you, listeners. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, send them to mailbag@andrewyang.com, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you. Well, no, just because Democrats have gotten stuck in the, defenders of the institution / status quo, and then the Republicans have the burn it down, it's not working, you're all full of it. And then there's this kind of in the middle, it's like, look, there are definitely reforms that would help things. Maybe we should be trying to make those happen. So we're not thrilled with everything that's going on now, but the move is not a wrecking ball. The tool is not a chainsaw. It's like, let's get in there and figure out how it can work better. So one thing I just wanted to share, because, I think you'll enjoy it. Like, abundance, I think, is a very important set of ideas and a very important book. And I'm really thrilled that you and Ezra are making this contribution. I just had on the podcast in the last 3 weeks the author of Why Nothing Works, Mark Dunkelman, who's making a similar case, and then Stuck by Yoni Applebaum, which like book length on the zoning. And so when I was reading, the abundance chapter on zoning, that obviously felt very, very familiar because I literally just read Stuck, a few weeks ago. And I feel like there's now this mini canon that you guys have built that is trying to address some of the drawbacks or failings or limitations of some of the institutions that are democratically, well, should say led by Democrats at present. And the Yoni story is around like, hey, zoning laws have made it impossible to build. So guess what? Housing in New York is crazy expensive, and like people aren't moving here. And if everyone got to move wherever they wanted, then you'd have a much more efficient economy. And I think there was a point in the book where you actually say, like, look, me and Ezra, like, we're actually kind of pointing this to the Democratic Party so that it can speed up.
Yeah, it's great. I love the idea of a mini abundance canon, and I do think we're all contributing toward the same idea, Yoni, Mark, Ezra, and me. I think there's a really powerful historical story to tell here, and I'd love to just take a bit of time to tell it.
Please.
It really deeply informs the project as Ezra and I see it. Going back 100 years, there's really been two major political orders. This is the Cambridge historian Gary Gerstl's term for a period of history where the parties agree on enough geopolitical and economic ideas that those agreements move history beyond the fights that determine 2-, 4-, and 6-year election cycles. You had the New Deal order, which reigned between the 1930s and 1960s, and the neoliberal order, which reigned between the 1970s and the 2010s. And each order tends to be defined by both an internal crisis and an external threat. So in the 1930s, you had the internal crisis of the Great Depression and the external threat of the global specter of socialism. And the New Deal was a way of solving for both problems at the same time. We emboldened government to act and to build things. And we really did. I mean, we built In the 1930s, the Tennessee Valley Authority, we used the Work Progress Administration to hire millions of people during the downturn. And then even in the 1950s, Dwight D. Eisenhower in many ways acquiesced to the New Deal order by governing as something like an FDR liberal, even though he was a Republican.
It wasn't a Democratic Republican thing, to your point. Yeah.
Exactly. He's talked about social welfare or welfare policies as if there was something to extend. He built the interstate highway system, which had its flaws, absolutely, but also was, I think, an extension of this era of building, this growth machine that came up after World War II. And that really changed in the 1970s, because in the 1970s you had a new internal crisis and external threat that defined the next political order. The internal crisis was a lot of cultural resentment at the collectivism of the New Deal order, and the crisis of stagflation, which FDR-style liberalism could not solve. We needed some new paradigm to address it in the minds of people. But also there was a new external threat. The Soviet Union meant something else in the 1980s than Russia meant in the 1920s and 1930s. And so the neoliberal order in many ways was this flourishing of a very particular style of individualism. And that individualism was represented by the deregulation styles of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and even to a certain extent Bill Clinton. It was represented by a sense that people on the new left, the poets and beatniks, and people on the right, the libertarian right, the economists like Milton Friedman, both talked about the individual being someone who needs to rail against the system, and this praise for like the solo individual against the collectivist crowd was a very, very keen idea in the 1960s and 1970s. And so we codified this new order of neoliberalism. And in many ways, just as Dwight D. Eisenhower acquiesced to an order invented by FDR, Bill Clinton, to a certain extent, acquiesced to an order inaugurated by Ronald Reagan. He believed in smaller government. He believed in deregulation. He was a liberal in some ways, but he was also very much a liberal for the age of Reagan. Our claim in our book is that we didn't just go from an age of New Deal liberalism to an age of neoliberalism. We went from an age of the growth machine, of constant change to the physical world, to the age of the anti-growth machine, an age of zoning, an age of environmental review, an age where NEPA and CEQA and all these laws...
Vetocracy.
And the you could say in a way, just to keep up with the rhyming game, that the New Deal created an era of bureaucracy and the neoliberal era created an order of Vetocracy. And now we're living in a world of both, where government is weirdly in many cases both big and weak. We're saying that the problems or the tools brought to bear by neoliberalism, or what at least Gerstle calls this era of neoliberalism, no longer serve us today. They don't solve affordability. They don't solve climate change. They don't solve the problem of ineffective governance where Democrats have the most power. And they don't solve the problem I just talked about understanding scientific and technological institutions and reforming them to pull forward the most important inventions in medicines. And so one thing we're trying to do here is to redefine the next political order. And of course that sounds ludicrously grandiose.
I love it.
That's the scale. That's the scale of the ambition.
I'm there for it. So what is the name of the new era?
We'll call it abundance if you like.
Oh yeah, no, I'm into it. You know who also should be included in the abundance can? I'm sure you'll agree with this. Jen Pahlka, Recoding America.
I was hoping you'd say her. Yeah, absolutely. If there's like a reader set of if you go on Amazon and buy the Abundance Canon and it's 7 books, absolutely Pahlka's book should be there.
Yeah. So please, man, what did I miss? Abundance, Why Nothing Works, Stuck, Recoding America. What else is in the canon?
There are a ton of writers and academics that belong in the canon. Matt Iglesias for sure, Noah Smith, Steve Tellis, the folks at Niskanen I think have done fantastic work.
Yeah, I like those people.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks. There's a constellation, right? A solar system here, and that's been one of the real joys of the project is. I was just talking to Ezra about this. Books are such a funny thing in that the conversation they generate tends to be much larger than the sales they generate. It's for every...
I don't know what you're talking about, Derek. No,
it's for every book sold, there's a podcast recording, and you can choose to interpret that in a negative light, or you can choose to see that the ultimate product of a book is the conversation. And I think one thing this book and these books have started to do is to concretize this set of thinkers, to get thinkers to understand how they relate to each other and how we're working on one set of ideas and it's different than other groups, other coalitions within the Democratic Party.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. How did you choose which internet service provider to use? The sad thing is, most of us didn't have much of a choice because ISPs operate a lot like monopolies in the regions that they serve. They then use this monopoly position to take advantage of customers, and yes, they even sell your data, your activities to advertisers and big tech companies, and you don't see a dime. That's why I protect my internet surfing and devices with ExpressVPN. When you use ExpressVPN, it's like a magic portal to a perfectly safe and anonymous internet. And don't take my word for it. This is the #1 VPN service according to CNET. It's used by major companies all over the world. So stop handing over your personal data to ISPs and other tech companies who then mine your activity and sell off your information. Protect yourself with a VPN I trust to keep my privacy online. Visit expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang to get 3 extra months free. Go to expressvpn.com/yang right now to learn more. I mean, interestingly, I think certainly in Mark's book, he says, look, I'm just talking to the Democratic Party here. Why? Because I'm a Democrat. And, I think you and Ezra say something similar. Yoni and Jen are probably less explicit. They're just, they're kind of saying, hey, it's like what I found, my experience. I mean, it's interesting in that I think that Americans of every political background could get on board with certainly elements of this. You open the book with a vision of utopia that itself actually I think is very important because it gets your mind your mind working. It's like, wait, why don't we have that? Why does that seem completely out of bounds of today's political discourse, which is about preventing the bad and then defining the bad in different ways. I'm thrilled that you include me in the constellation.
Absolutely,
I suppose universal basic income seems very abundant.
And you believe in technology. I think it's very important to say that this is a book that could have been just 3 or 4 chapters long, right? We could have gone introduction, here's our manifesto, chapter 1, housing, chapter 2, energy, chapter 3, state capacity or how to make government work, and here are the ways in which we think governments become highly ineffective as liberals have become more interested in process over outcomes. And then we could have clapped ourselves in the back and said, job done, we're out of the picture. It's important to me that this book have chapters on science, invention, and technology deployment.
That was one of my favorite.
It's really important to me because I think liberalism should be proud of its vision of the future. And I think political movements need both a negative and positive identity. By negative identity, I mean they need a sense of negative polarization. What are you against? What are you defining yourself against? And I personally think defining ourselves against Donald Trump is one of the easiest jobs in the world, but I'm happy to talk about the ways in which I think he's pursuing an anti-abundance policy. But also liberals need, I think, a positive vision of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
If not just for the campaign trail, then for actually governing. Because, right now we have DOGE, a Department of Government efficiency, but efficiency toward what outcome?
They could rename themselves Sledge.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, because what they're doing is really just taking a hammer to things.
Yeah, slow lobotomization. It's right, exactly. It's not creative destruction. It's destruction is what they're doing. And I don't think that they have a very clear sense of what they're trying to build efficiency toward outside of trying to centralize power in the executive branch.
Well, the thing is they don't define the purpose of the agency to solve whatever problem that the agency is working on. It's like, hey, USAID's mission is, let's say, to improve the well-being of people in these various countries. Like, how do I do that more effectively? Instead, they just saw it as a cost center. It's like, how can I reduce cost? I mean, it's very overly simplistic. So I am totally on board with the abundance agenda. I think that to the extent that I'm fascinated by it is that you just said right now, it's like, hey, this is like a faction within the Democratic Party. Do you know Misha Chellam?
Of course.
Also part of the Abundance Project, Misha Chellam, who founded the Abundance Network. And what they're doing is, love Misha. Shout out to you, Misha. So they have started chapters in some major cities that are democratic, trying to make the case for this, to the extent that there's a faction within the Democratic Party, the Abundance Network and Misha's outfit, which operates primarily in the Bay Area, but I think they have a chapter in New York City now. Hopefully they're spreading to other cities. They're what I think of in terms of someone within the Democratic Party. Are there other folks like that?
There's a lot of folks working in this space. There's Abundance chapters. There are YIMBY chapters at the state and local level. There's Open Philanthropy has opened a new tranche of money that they're going to spend on a bunch of different initiatives under the framework of Abundance. So there's a ton of energy here, but it is a little bit gestational still, which is interesting and exciting, right? There is no think tank, I think, that is the singular think tank for the kind of abundance that Ezra Klein and I are talking about. We're still forming all of these ideas. This is still like a grassroots movement rather than something that sort of has institutional tent poles attached to it.
Well, I certainly hope that Forward becomes part of this, where one of my goals always with Forward is just you had like a massive movement of people who advocate for good people and policies in various environments, kind of free of institutional constraints. So if someone is trying to do something, in a blue city or a rural red area and it's good, then, we should get behind them. And one of my complaints about the current system is that if you're a Democrat, you will have very little sway in, rural red state, and it's not something that you're, going to be concerned with. And our hope is to try and improve things everywhere. I've had interesting conversations with Misha where some of his people have been saying like, hey, you guys need to team up. I still hope the grand team up happens. I dare say that you and Ezra are the most prominent makers of this case to date, in my mind. You've given it a name. You've given it something of a framework. What's been fun for me is, Jen's book came out a couple of years ago. I was read that and be like, ooh, and then like I can tell that you guys love Jen's work, and
she's all over our book. To be clear, she's all over chapter 4. Yeah,
that's one reason why it was very, very clear to me. Shout out to you too, Jen. Hopefully, you'll see this as well. I tend to think in terms of organizations and movements. And so there's some part of me that thinks like, hey, you guys should be kicking off a think tank in this direction. Niskanen is probably the closest thing that exists that I can think of.
Or the Institute for Progress does really, really great work on science policy. I think their science policy is very abundance forward. They do good work on immigration, infrastructure. So I know the guys at IFP and the women at IFP. I think they're sensational too. I don't know if they would call themselves sort of abundance pilled. They exist at sort of a different level of contact with politics and policy, but our interests, I think, are very closely aligned. And a lot of my work on science policy is heavily informed by the folks at Institute for Progress.
Well, shout out to them too then. Has this book taken shape the way that, you kind of imagine? You get this message from Ezra. You're like, hey, let's team up on this. You're like, ooh, is Ezra a jerk to work with? No, I'm kidding.
No, he's not. He was really wonderful. The book was incredibly hard to write. Books are a pain in the ass, is what I say. Books are hard to write. Books like this are really hard to write for maybe, let's name 3 different reasons. One, there's pieces of this book that are absolutely a manifesto. Right? We're trying to invent a style of even a philosophy of politics, and that's just hard to do because there's been a lot of people that have thought about styles and philosophies of politics. So to write something that makes contact with the world in a unique way is an enormous challenge. Number 2 is that this book required a lot of research. It required a really deep understanding of what's gone wrong, right? We didn't want to be violators of Chesterton's fence, the principle that if you're going to move a fence in the wood, make sure you understand what the fence does before you tear it down. We wanted to understand every fence that we put our fingers on. And so understanding that required an enormous amount of research, books read and papers read and journals read. And then finally, I think that writing a book that is about, in some ways, the present is hard because the timeline of books is very different than the timeline of reality. Reality moves forward 1 second at a time, and books tend to be finished 6 to 9 months before they're actually published. Like, little known fact for people who aren't in the book world, half a year can expire in many cases between a book being done and it hitting bookshelves. Very hard to be au courant in modern politics if there's going to be a 6-month lag.
Yeah.
We were able, thanks to our wonderful publisher, Avid, we were able
It seems very current, by the way.
We were able to touch up the book just enough after Trump won, with the understanding that we needed to not change our message, but just shade it toward the reality that this was coming out.
Very modern and relevant.
And maybe the fourth thing is that it's, one unfortunate, deeply unfortunate aspect of the book's good timing is that the modern Democratic Party right now is reputationally in shambles. And that's not me editorializing.
No, it's just numbers.
That's just numbers. Yeah. It's polling worse than it's ever polled.
Yeah, 29% approve. 50...
I'm going to say 29% is in shambles. Yeah, I think that it qualifies in the shambles threshold.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely does. It's generationally low number, and the disapproval is something like twice that. I mean, it might be like 29% approve, 57% disapprove. I mean, that's shambles.
And there's no clear leader. Right? There's no one to look to say, well, is Kamala going to define the Democratic Party? Is AOC? What you have instead is a debate. Yeah. You have this very, very open pre-primary of ideas to determine what the Democratic Party is going to be about going through the year of chaos of 25, going into the 26 midterms, and then going into the 27 Democratic primary process.
Dude, I hope that everyone who runs in that primary picks up abundance and just takes everything out of it and says, hey, like this is going to be the platform and the message. This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've been on a quest for the perfect mattress for my entire adult life. Why? Well, you do it 8 hours a day. I like to be active. My back sometimes acts up. So I wanted a firm mattress that offered me support, that did not overheat. I took the Helix Sleep quiz and got matched with a Dawn firm mattress. And it's been a game changer. It's been awesome. I have not had a single issue. And I got to say, people have come up to me and said, hey, I ordered a Helix Sleep mattress, and it's all been rave reviews, not a single issue. It's been an awesome partnership. And the biggest partnership is that I lie down on the freaking mattress every night, and I wake up refreshed and ready to go. Don't take my word for it. Go to helixsleep.com and check it out for yourself. And if you order a mattress, you can always return it without any issue because they have that much confidence in the product. Go to helixsleep.com/yang for March Madness sale of 25% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/yang, 25% off site-wide. helixsleep.com/yang. I wanted to share an anecdote. So I was in Iowa an eternity ago. Now, it was like during the last cycle, and then there were various candidates, and you were talking to Democratic Party activists, and so everyone was talking. Like, I got up and talked about AI and trucks and da-da-da, and they had no idea how to respond. I got like polite applause, and then a senator who shall remain nameless just got up and said, we're gonna Democratic talking point after Democratic talking point. It was like, we're gonna fight for, and most of which, by the way, I was on board with. I mean, who's not like, there are obviously wrinkles. But to your point, in the mission of this book is like, there wasn't a political language around like the stuff I was talking about. And so like the party activists were like, well, like, interesting, a magical Asian man from the future talking about something called AI. Like, it was all like very, very, then it's like, oh, this guy, like, now this 70-year-old senator is now like giving me what I know to applaud to. Yay. Yeah. And so there was like a process there. And the fact that you guys have the vision and the care, really, because, and the belief that you could make a difference. And happily, I mean, if anyone can make a difference, it's you and Ezra, because you guys are among the most prominent thinkers in the country, and have a lot of street cred with folks who might be in position to make some of these changes. So I do hope that forward folks pick up a copy of Abundance, and like let's have this as like a vision that people can get excited about. Any of these political candidates of the future, and I know a lot of the people who are going to be running for that nomination in 28. Like, just get a copy of Abundance and just start hitting the message, because this is the kind of politics that can transcend our current clash to nowhere. like the the prevention of bad is not necessarily a compelling vision of the future.
Well, I mean, I want to amen to that, and I really thank you for the work that you've done helping to blaze this path. I think, what's really important to us is to find a way to get these ideas into the public conversation. If people disagree, that's wonderful. There is no world in which every single Democratic candidate in 2027 defines themselves as an abundance liberal. In fact, if too many of them do, then it will reduce the value of any one person identifying themselves as an abundance liberal. We recognize and are prepared for the fact that some people are going to disagree with this. They're going to want to emphasize antitrust more. They're going to want to emphasize welfare more. And I want to be clear, we are absolutely pro-welfare liberals, and antitrust plays, I think, a major critical role in consumer protection. They're not mutually exclusive at all. It's a matter of emphasis. There's going to be people who want to emphasize, oligarchy more and attack billionaires first. We're certainly not against the idea that there are bad billionaires afoot. But to quickly juxtapose, I think, the message of abundance versus the message that the most important thing to do is to name and shame the billionaires is something like this. One of the most important problems that we identify in the book is the fact that in areas, states, and cities where liberals, Democrats have the most power, that's where we have the worst housing crisis.
Oh, yeah. And then Ezra talks about how you have hundreds of thousands of people that are relocating out of New York
and the housing crisis is
Illinois.
Cashing out in hundreds of thousands of people leaving places that Democrats are governing. The reason that San Francisco's housing is a mess, and California's housing is a mess, and Portland's housing is a mess, and Oregon's housing is a mess, and et cetera, Elon Musk has nothing to do with any of that. Elon Musk has nothing to do with the housing politics of Oregon. We need to be clear-eyed about how we are doing this to ourselves. And that's a really tough message for people to hear, because Donald Trump is so destructive and is so dangerous. And the threat that he poses to constitutional order and democracy is so...
He wouldn't be in position to be president and win if some of the things that you're describing had been addressed like X years earlier. I mean, that to me, it's like he is president for the second time, in part because of some of the institutional failures. Now, none of us has a time machine, but one of the things I just want to quote from the book, it said, like, the Democratic Party can't be the party of the working class if the working class can't afford to live in the place they govern.
That seems inarguable to me. I don't know how we can possibly claim to be the party of the working class if we're the party of the cities and the states where the working class are leaving. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And they're moving to states like Texas and Florida where they can afford a better life. And in those states, you have much more Republican governance. We should be scandalized by this. We should be absolutely embarrassed and scandalized and angry about the fact that we are losing the working class, not just at the polls, but they're voting with the most expensive voting mechanism they have, which is with their feet. It's very cumbersome to move. You only move when you're desperate, especially if it's across the country. And so their desperation is a deep, deep indictment of the low level of democratic governance in these states. We should think of the places that we govern as potentially being advertisements for our cause, not anti-advertisements, right? As we say in the book, we should hope that we point to California and say, vote for Democrats and we'll make America like California. And instead right now is we have lots of Republicans who think they have advantage in saying, vote for Democrats and they'll make America like California. That's what it looks like when you make the places you control an anti-advertisement. And we should hope that the process of rebuilding power for Democrats and liberalism in this country begins at that local level, right? Begins at building power where we already have it, turning the places that we control, turning the places we've been elected into advertisements for our cause. That's the beginning, I think, of this movement.
Have you made a New Year's resolution that's related to eating healthier, being a little bit more fit, losing a little bit of weight? Well, have I got great news for you. Factor meals can help you actually achieve that goal. Imagine fully prepared meals sent to you fresh. I'm good at a lot of things, I will confess, but I'm really crappy at cooking. And Factor makes it so that you can have a completely delicious, awesome meal in the comfort of your own home that's healthy, it's good for you. You know when you eat something and you know it's healthy? That's the experience with Factor. When I ordered it, the Nona's Bolognese, the mustard chicken, they hit the spot. They're quick, they're convenient, they get the job done, and then some. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. I have a pitch for you. This will be super fun, maybe. So I was imagining you have some very, very good ideas in the book. I love the idea of essentially having prizes and innovation prizes. Mm-hmm. And what I was thinking is like, hey, is there some sort of rundown community that would then throw itself open and say, guess what, guys, we're going to be the emblem, the advertisement for the abundance agenda. Like all of the, all of like the bureaucratic rules and how we're going to throw them out the window because what have we got to lose? We are like town X. We've been losing population anyway. Let's just like go in all in. And then this city could be your like walking, talking advertisement for what the abundance agenda can look like in real life. Anyway, that's my pitch. Is like we should settle on a town that's somewhat frankly struggling.
Sure, a Youngstown sort of situation and try to make them the abundant city of the future. I love this idea. I love the concept of experimentation. And so, of course, I love the idea of trying to invent new frontier cities for the next generation through an abundance agenda. I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I would love to see it succeed. The only wrinkle I would add here is that it's very important not only that we build or grow new cities with these kind of policies, but also that we reform the cities that exist.
Oh, yeah.
Because New York and San Francisco are incredibly important centers for invention and innovation and upward mobility.
I mean, it would be the most powerful argument ever, to your point. If the Democratic Party was like, hey, check it out, like look at these awesome places and their models of governance, I mean, that right. would be the highest achievement.
I mean, to a certain extent, unfortunately for the Democrats' case, if you look at Texas and what's happened to the housing markets of Texas, that's an extraordinary advertisement for the possibility of adding supply.
Yeah.
I mean, since Austin went on its building spree, rents have gone down. We saw similar things happen
and it's a boom town.
And it's a boom town.
Yeah.
And it's a really clear example that there's problems you can solve with supply. Unfortunately, it's not obvious that the existence of Austin has changed the minds of people in, say, Southern California, right? You, in many cases, still have the same YIMBY politics that you had 5, 10, 20 years ago, even though on any given day, someone could open up a newspaper or Our World in Data and say, look at what's happening in Austin. So I think that you're right that this is a message that could be advocated for or achieved by having these sort of experimental startup cities.
It's a both
but
and,
it's also
man.
something that we really want to win these fights in the most important cities in this country.
Oh, I'd love for it to sweep California and New York. I mean, immediately, in addition to whatever little frontier testing ground and the rest of it. And we're way behind the curve. I mean, a lot of the stuff that you guys write about, you think man, if some of this had been addressed better 20, 30 years ago, in my opinion, Donald Trump won in large part because of some of these things going unaddressed. Hey, better late than never, I mean, I'm really grateful that you guys are making this case now. And there's there's like a real soul searching phase that's going on, but you guys have done it in an extraordinarily rigorous, well-researched way that paints a picture of the future that we should be fighting for, and that we actually kind of can achieve. If you were really generous, maybe we even deserve. maybe your kids, my kids, maybe we'll be able to deliver something that we're actually proud of. That was always the goal.
I certainly hope so. And, you mentioned Trump, and I think it's very important to be explicit about how cleanly this argument pushes back against the current regime, right? Donald Trump won on affordability. He won because enough Americans decided that they could not accept and would not accept the price levels of the last 4 years. And a huge part of that was the cost of housing and where the cost of housing has gone in not just the last 4 years, but the last few decades. Donald Trump had an opportunity there to become the affordability candidate, to become the candidate of supply-side abundance, right?
I thought at minimum he'd build a lot because that should have been his jam, but he never did.
That was a card on the table. And instead, he's done the opposite. I mean, you look at the effect of the tariff policy. Among many other absolute inanities of his tariff policy or strategy, if we can even call it that, of announcing a tariff at 9 a.m. and then changing it at 3:30 p.m. and then announcing it 2 weeks later at 9:37 a.m. and obviously horrendous in so many ways, and speaks to the fact that there's no real strategy outside of a personal inclination of loving to be on the phone with world leaders to work out little deals. He could have run on housing affordability. Instead, one thing the tariffs did is they raised the cost of two of the most important inputs to home construction: soft lumber, which comes from Canada, and drywall materials that come from Mexico. And on March 7th, right after the first round of tariffs were announced, the National Association of Home Builders, NAHB, wrote in a rather alarmed memo,
hey man, this is going to be really bad.
There's only one thing this can possibly do to the price of housing. You are raising the most important inputs to the price of housing. But it really goes far beyond that. I mean, one thing that I've observed in the first few weeks of the Trump administration is that it's almost as if for every scarcity that he sees in the economy, he wants to introduce a new scarcity to the economy. He says, we don't have enough manufacturing, so we need less trade. We don't have enough housing, so we need fewer immigrants. We don't have good enough science, so we need less scientific funding. This approach, where everything we don't have enough of means there's something else we have to take away from Americans that they need, is really, really bad. And it's very bad for the country. The only way it's even remotely good is for the purposes of defining abundance against it.
Yes. He is kind of Mr. Scarcity.
Yes.
In a way. And you know what the opposite of Mr. Scarcity is? Mr. Abundance or Mrs. Abundance. Or Mrs. Abundance. Yeah, no, yes, you're right. So I'm thrilled that you guys teamed up to make this argument. I would urge everyone to pick up Abundance by Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein in that order. I'm just kidding. If someone wants to keep up with you and your work, how can they best do so?
I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic, and I host the podcast Plain English. And they can find me on Twitter, X, I suppose, but find me first where I live.
Yes. Do keep an eye out for Derek's writing. He has to write because it's his job. But I will say, I learn from the guy regularly, just about every week or two. Derek, congratulations, man. Best of luck with the book and the book tour. And let's make abundance a reality. There's no reason why in the richest, most advanced society in the history of the world, we cannot actually solve some of these problems.
Thanks for your leadership here, and thanks also for the interview. This is really fun.